In the name of God. Amen. I, Honoria Mary Pelham, widow of Bayfield Hall in the parish of Bayfield by Holt, in the county of Norfolk, being of sound and disposing mind, memory, and understanding, do hereby make and ordain this, my last will and testament, in the manner following. First, I direct that my body shall be decently buried in the south churchyard of St. Margaret's of Bayfield, beside the grave of my late husband, Sir Theodore Pelham, 3rd Baronet, departed this life October 14th, 1809. Second, I give, devise and bequeath to my great niece, Miss Henrietta Pelham, only surviving child of my late nephew, the Reverend Augustus Pelham, lately curate of St. Andrew's of Holt, the whole of my real and personal estate, comprising A. The dwelling house called Bayfield Hall, together with the home pasture of 178 acres, the walled south garden, the 8-acre apple and pear orchard, the flint dovecote of 1748, the Pelham poultry yard at the south kitchen wall, with the 6 Sussex Dorking hens lately settled there since 1814, and the foundation pair of Polish crested birds lately received from Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park, in October. Last, and all appurtenances. B. The contents of the South Library, being 404 volumes principally classical and historical, the Pelham family plate of 92 pieces, marked Norwich 1788, and all household goods and chattels at Bayfield Hall. C. The further sum of £3,500 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, to hold the same in fee simple absolute, in her own sole and separate use, with no entail, no life interest, and no reservation. Third, to my faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Anstis, of 32 years' service at Bayfield Hall, I give 12 months' wages above the customary annual stipend. Fourth, to my steward, Mr. Pendlebury, I give £2 and my late husband's small Norfolk flint pocket spyglass, and to the Reverend Sandys, parish curate, I give the worn brass standish of my late mother in token of his patient kindness at my long autumnal decline. Fifth, I nominate, constitute, and appoint Mr. Camberwell of the Marketplace, Holt, attorney and solicitor at law, sole executor of this my last will and testament, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and seal this 20th day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1819. Honoria Mary Pelham, seal. Signed, sealed, published, and declared by the said Honoria Mary Pelham, as and for her last will and testament, in the presence of Reverend Sandys, curate of Bayfield by Holt, Pendlebury, steward of Bayfield Hall, on the Tuesday morning of the 23rd of November, in the year 1819, Miss Henrietta Pelham walked the short flagged way from the small back cottage of the Holt parsonage to the marketplace chambers of Mr. Camberwell. Henrietta Pelham was tall, 5 feet 6, and upright with the level gravity of the Norfolk parsonage, soft fair hair plaited at the nape under a plain dark mourning cap, calm grey eyes the colour of the Norfolk salt-marsh sky, fair Norfolk skin, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix. She had walked the short way many times these 8 years past upon parish errands, the curate's daughter to the Holt solicitor, with a folded note for her late father, a sheaf of subscription lists for the parish school, the small quarter-day rents of the parsonage glebe. The errand this morning was of a different order. Mr. Camberwell's letter had reached her by Norfolk post on the Saturday previous, and lay folded in the small travelling case at her hand. The late great-aunt of whom Henrietta had heard her father speak with the careful, measured kindness of a man who had never himself crossed to Bayfield, the great-aunt she had not in her 28 years met or written to, had named Henrietta sole legatee, and Mr. Camberwell desired her presence at his chambers upon the Tuesday morning. The marketplace lay under a settled grey Norfolk sky. The brick front of Mr. Camberwell's chambers was plain, the brass plate at the door polished, the small inner room scrupulously kept. Mr. Camberwell received her at the inner door, took her hand a moment in the careful Norfolk manner of a man who had known her late father, and showed her to the green baize writing table set under the south window. He was 60, in plain dark wool, gold-rimmed spectacles set well upon the bridge of his nose. She set the small travelling case at the chair beside her. She took from it her small green calf poultry journal, the journal she had kept these 4 years past at the Holt Parsonage henhouse, and laid it at the green baize a little to the left of her hand, as she was accustomed to lay it when she sat down to her settled work. The gesture was unthinking. The journal was small and worn at the corners, with a brass clasp of no ornament, and the cover bore in her own neat ink, at the upper left, the words Holt Parsonage Henhouse, H. Pelham, begun 1815. Mr. Camberwell, gold-rimmed spectacles a little forward, saw the journal and the careful clasp and the neat ink at the cover, and his face eased to a kind half-smile. "Miss Pelham," he said, "I had heard from Reverend Penberthy at the parsonage that you kept a careful flock at the back garden. The Dorking hens principally, with the spangled Hamburg cockerel and a pair of the Polish crested. I am to ask, in the executor's capacity, whether you shall continue the poultry yard at Bayfield." The late Mrs. Pelham was particular upon the point. Henrietta laid her hand a moment upon the small green calf cover. "I shall, Mr. Camberwell," she said. "If the late great-aunt's settled wish was that the poultry yard continue, I shall continue it." "Thank you, Miss Pelham," said Mr. Camberwell, in a voice that had eased a further degree. "I shall enter that in the executor's note. Now, the matter of the family connection. I should set it before you before we open the will, because the connection is at 4 removes, and you have been so seldom written to that you may not know the particulars." He drew a small folded paper from the writing desk, opened it, and read in a quiet, legal voice. The late Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham, widow of Bayfield Hall, was the widow of Sir Theodore Pelham, 3rd Baronet of Bayfield, who died on the 14th of October 1809. Sir Theodore Pelham was the elder brother of your own late grandfather, Mr. Octavius Pelham of Holt, curate before your father at St. Andrews. The brothers parted at Sir Theodore's marriage to the late Mrs. Honoria in the year 1772. Sir Theodore came over from Holt to Bayfield, 4 miles east, upon his settlement at the Hall, and Mrs. Honoria, who was the only daughter of a Norfolk Howard cousin of your own late mother, came over from Norwich to Bayfield in the same year, and never in the 47 years following crossed the 4 miles to Holt. Henrietta inclined her head. She had heard her father name the great-aunt at the parsonage breakfast table upon a quarter-day more than once, in the careful Norfolk manner. She had not before heard the year of the marriage given. "Now," Mr. Camberwell continued, "in the 4 years from 1815 to the present, the late Mrs. Pelham was at the Bayfield estate, corresponding annually with your late father, the Reverend Augustus, at the 4 quarter-days, Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas, by the Norfolk post. After your late father's death in 1817, she continued to write at the quarter-days, addressed at the Holt parsonage, the half-correspondence, that is, her own letters to your late father which he had kept, and his replies, which Mrs. Pelham had kept and lately returned by her steward, is now in my keeping at the chambers, and I shall send it over to the parsonage cottage upon your settled wish. The Reverend Penberthy delivered up your late father's half upon the parsonage clearance in 1817. "I should be grateful, Mr. Camberwell," Henrietta said. "I shall read them in the order of their dates." "Very good." He took up a small brass key, turned it in the lock of the writing-table drawer, and laid 5 several items at the green baize between them. "First, the copy of the will, engrossed in my clerk's hand for your keeping. A folded heavy paper, sealed. Second, the brass ring of 6 keys for Bayfield Hall, south door, library, the late great-aunt's writing cabinet, the plate chest at the butler's pantry, the south garden gate, and the poultry yard wicket. A small brass ring with 6 worn keys at it. Third, the Bank of England draft for £3,500 in the 3% consols, drawn to the order of Miss Henrietta Pelham. A folded slip on bank paper. Fourth, a sealed personal letter from the late Mrs. Pelham to yourself, sealed in the Pelham crimson wax with the family crest, dated the 18th of October, 2 days before the will. The seal is unbroken. I have not myself read it. A small folded letter, the crimson wax disc at the fold. Fifth, the calling card of the Reverend Sandys, parish curate of Bayfield by Holt, with his own short note at the back, asking that you call at his vicarage at your convenience upon your arrival at Bayfield. A small card. Henrietta drew each of the 5 items toward her in the order in which they had been set out. She did not at once open the personal letter. She set it a little to the right of the green calf poultry journal, where the crimson wax disc caught the grey window light at its careful edge. The brass ring of keys she set at her left hand. The draft she folded once and laid at the inner pocket of her gabardine. The copy of the will and the curate's card she set together at the front of the green baize. "Mr. Camberwell," she said, "I shall read the will at the cottage this afternoon, and the personal letter at the south window of the cottage parlour where the light is settled. The keys I shall keep upon my person until the journey. The draft I shall pay to my account at Gurney's of Norwich at the Holt branch upon the Wednesday following. The Reverend Sandys I shall write to within the week. Shall the journey to Bayfield be upon the Tuesday next?" "The Tuesday next would suit, Miss Pelham. I shall hire the post-chaise from the Feathers at Leatheringset and accompany you the 4 miles. Mr. Yelverton, the butler, and Mrs. Anstis, the housekeeper, will receive you at the south porch. The household has been kept at its full strength since the late great-aunt's death on the 12th of November, by the late great-aunt's own settled instruction lodged at the chambers in October." "Thank you, Mr. Camberwell." There was a small further pause. Mr. Camberwell took off his gold-rimmed spectacles, polished them at a square of plain linen, and set them again upon the bridge of his nose. "Miss Pelham, I should add, only what is fitting. The late Mrs. Pelham was a woman of careful temper and settled habit. She and your late father wrote at the 4 quarter days in a hand of measured kindness on either side. She did not, in the 47 years at Bayfield, cross to Holt, and your father, in his own settled way, did not himself cross to Bayfield. The breach, if it was a breach, was at Sir Theodore's marriage in 1772, and was not of either of their making, and was not, in the late Mrs. Pelham's last years, an unsettled matter, only an unmended one. I think it is right that you should know it." "I am grateful, Mr. Camberwell. I had not known the year." "There is the further small particular, Miss Pelham, that the late Mrs. Pelham in October, that is in the last weeks at Bayfield, set out at length in the personal letter at your hand a wish concerning the poultry yard. I am not at liberty to set it out at this table, as the seal is yours. But I am at liberty to say that the wish is settled, and is, in the executor's view, a wish of the most patient and most considered kind." Henrietta inclined her head. She set her hand a brief moment upon the small green calf cover of the poultry journal at the green baize, the careful, unthinking gesture of a settled mind, and drew the personal letter a little nearer. "Then I shall read it this afternoon, Mr. Camberwell. Shall I sign at the executor's receipt?" "At the foot of the page, Miss Pelham, with the date." Mr. Camberwell laid the receipt page at the baize and unstoppered the small inkstand. Henrietta wrote in her even, neat hand, "Henrietta Pelham, 23rd November 1819, Holt," and laid down the pen. Mr. Camberwell folded the receipt, set it at the inner drawer, and rose. Henrietta rose. She set the small green calf poultry journal at the travelling case, the brass ring of keys at the inner pocket beside the bank draft, the copy of the will and the personal letter and the curate's card at the small inner sleeve where her father's prayer book had used to ride. She drew the travelling case to her hand and let Mr. Camberwell open the inner door. "Miss Pelham," he said at the door, "I shall send the half correspondence over to the cottage this afternoon by my clerk, the Tuesday next at the morning post-chaise at the parsonage gate. Until then, the parish school, I think, keeps you to the dinner hour." "To the dinner hour, Mr. Camberwell. Mrs. Skelton has been very good. I have given notice at Michaelmas quarter-day past." "Very good, Miss Pelham. Until the Tuesday next." She walked back through the marketplace, under the same settled grey Norfolk sky. The bell at St. Andrew's was striking the hour as she turned at the parsonage lane, but she did not count the strokes. She had the brass ring of keys at her inner pocket, and the folded bank draft, and the curate's card, and the engrossed copy of the will, and the unbroken seal of the Pelham crimson wax at the personal letter. She had the green calf poultry journal at the travelling case. She had, though she did not name it to herself, the half correspondence of 4 years between her late father and the great-aunt she had never met, soon to be at her hand at the south window of the cottage parlour. She took her dinner at the parsonage cottage at the settled dinner hour with Mrs. Cromer of the reading school, who had walked over from the schoolroom at the close of the morning lessons. Mrs. Cromer was not herself a Pelham connection, and did not press at the matter of the will. She set out the cold mutton and the small dish of pickled samphire that the parsonage cook had kept from the Saturday, and she said only that the reading school would manage the dinner hour at the second mistress's chair without difficulty for the 4 weeks of notice, and that she was glad Miss Pelham was to have the settled house at Bayfield. Henrietta acquiesced. They spoke of the parish school subscriptions and of the small Norfolk samphire, and not of the matter of the chambers. After dinner, Mrs. Cromer walked back to the schoolroom. Henrietta carried the travelling case to the small south parlour of the cottage. The south parlour had at its window a settled grey Norfolk light that fell across the writing table and the small carpet, the same settled light her father had read his sermons at, the same settled light at which her own green calf poultry journal had been kept these 4 years. Beyond the window, the parsonage hen-house stood at the south garden. A small plain flint and brick lean-to with a slate roof, the wicket on its single hinge, the 6 Dorking hens at their winter cluster at the inner straw, the spangled Hamburg cockerel, Norwich, pacing the perch with his careful, settled tread. She set the engrossed copy of the will at the writing table. She drew the small personal letter from the inner sleeve. She broke the Pelham crimson wax in the careful, unhurried way of a woman who had broken many seals at the parsonage these 8 years past, and unfolded the single sheet. The hand was a gentle, settled italic of an elder Norfolk lady, the ink a careful brown. It was dated Bayfield Hall, October 18th, 1819. "My dear great-niece," the letter began, "I have not in 47 years at Bayfield crossed the 4 miles to Holt, and I do not believe at my present settled hour that I shall. I have nevertheless these 4 quarter-days past, Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas, from 1815 forward, set aside the quarter-day morning at the South Library window, to read again the letters of your late father, the Reverend Augustus, at the careful order of their dates. I read them at the same hour each quarter-day, and I read them through in the order of the years. They are gentle letters, and they are settled letters, and the Reverend Augustus was a man of patient kindness. He wrote of you at every letter from 1815, of your settled work at Mrs. Skelton's reading school, of the parish school subscriptions, of the small hen-house at the parsonage south garden, which you began at his settled gift of the Dorking hens at the Michaelmas of 1815. I have at Bayfield kept the Pelham poultry yard at the south kitchen wall these 47 years past, 6 Sussex Dorking hens since 1814, and the spangled Hamburg of the older line and the Old English game I had of Sir Theodore's settlement. The settled wish of my last weeks is that the poultry yard shall continue at the same patient pace. In the October now closing, I have received at the Seabright basket from Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park in Hertfordshire, a foundation pair of the Polish crested, a hen and a cockerel, the cockerel of the careful tall crest, at the cost of £4 and 10 shillings paid at his receipt at my writing table on the 14th of October. The pair were settled at the new pen at the south kitchen wall on the Saturday following the 16th by Mr. Pendlebury's hand. They are settled and they are at the careful Norfolk feed, and the Reverend Sandys has seen them. The Polish crested I have set out at the Bayfield poultry yard, at the careful settled wish that you, my great niece, who have at your own parsonage, hen house these 4 years past, kept the Dorking line and the spangled Hamburg, at the careful Seabright fashion, shall continue them. Your great aunt at the settled hour, Honoria Mary Pelham. Henrietta read the letter through in the unhurried Norfolk manner. She read it through a second time. She set it at the writing table, beside the engrossed copy of the will and the curate's card, and she stood a brief while at the south window with her hand at the small green calf cover of the poultry journal at the travelling case. The parsonage henhouse stood at the south garden. The settled grey Norfolk light was easing toward the close of the afternoon. The spangled Hamburg cockerel, Norwich, had taken the perch at the inner roost. The 6 Dorking hens were at their winter cluster. She drew on her plain dark cloak and walked out at the small parlour door to the henhouse. The wicket gave at her settled hand. She stood at the inner straw a brief while and watched the cockerel at the perch. Norwich, who had been hatched at the parsonage 2 springs past from the foundation, pair her late father had given her at the Michaelmas of 1815, who had the careful, settled tread of the spangled Hamburg cockerel of the old Norfolk line. The 6 Dorking hens at the winter cluster were of the same settled Sussex line her father had given her, with the famous 5-toed feature at the careful inner foot. She did not feed them. The parsonage cook had fed them at the morning. She walked back to the south parlour. She took up the green calf poultry journal from the travelling case, drew the small stone inkstand to her hand, and set down the careful evening entry in her even neat ink at the next blank page after the entry of the Saturday previous. Cockerel Norwich, Spangled Hamburg, Tuesday 23rd November 1819, Holt Parsonage Henhouse, Mr. Camberwell's chambers this morning. She closed the brass clasp at the cover. She set the green calf journal at its settled place on the writing table beside the engrossed copy of the will, the brass ring of 6 keys, the bank draft, folded once at the inner sleeve, the unfolded personal letter in the gentle settled italic, and the small calling card of the Reverend Sandys of Bayfield by Holt. The bell at St. Andrew's struck somewhere beyond the parsonage wall. Henrietta did not count it. She drew the small chair to the south window and sat in the level Norfolk composure her father had taught her, with the parsonage henhouse beyond the window and the half-correspondence of 4 years at the inner sleeve awaiting Mr. Camberwell's clerk at the cottage gate. On the cool Norfolk Tuesday morning of the 30th of November, in the year 1819, 7 days after Mr. Camberwell of the marketplace at Holt had read aloud the last will and testament of the late Mrs. Honoria Pelham at the green baize writing table of his chambers, the small hired post-chaise of Mr. Camberwell drew up at the south wicket of the Holt parsonage cottage to convey Miss Henrietta Pelham the 4 miles east to Bayfield Hall in the parish of Bayfield by Holt, and Henrietta, in her plain dark morning gabardine, with the small green calf poultry journal in her travelling case, and the brass ring of 6 keys at her plain reticule, and the £3, 500 Bank of England, draft folded thrice at her plain pocket-book, stepped up into the chaise with the level Norfolk composure her late father, the Reverend Augustus Pelham, had kept all his days at the curacy of St. Andrew's of Holt. The chaise rolled gently out of the Holt market-place, along the eastern Norfolk lane, in the thin, clear Norfolk light of late November, past the small flint and pantile cottages of the Holt parish, past the leafless, brown, ploughed acres of the Norfolk gentle ridge, where the November-winter wheat showed at the furrow in narrow green stripes, and at the 2nd mile halted briefly at the small wayside inn, the Feathers at Leatheringset, kept by Mr. and Mrs. Edgecombe these 18 years past for the post-boy to water the pair, where Henrietta, in level Norfolk silence, took a small cup of plain hot Norfolk parish tea at the parlour window, and looked east along the lane toward the gentle ridge above the Glaven Valley, where the pantile roofs of Bayfield Hall stood at the rim of the brown winter pasture. And at the half-hour, the chaise rolled on the further 2 miles east through the small village of Leatheringset, and along the gentle Glaven Ridge, and at the bend of the lane drew up at last at the south porch of Bayfield Hall in the thin, clear Norfolk afternoon light. The south porch of Bayfield Hall stood under the plain stone-mullioned south windows of the flint and brick Norfolk manor of the year 1746 in the Pelham settled fashion. 2 stories of plain napped Norfolk flint, with brick dressings at the quoins, and the pantile roof at the gentle Norfolk pitch, and the 3 brick chimneys at the level Norfolk ridge, and on the worn stone step of the south porch, Mr. Yelverton, the butler of 52 years' service, stood in plain black tailcoat, with the brass house keys at the hip and the small folded receiving tray in the right hand. Mr. Yelverton, 56, plain black tailcoat, plain linen at the throat, the weathered Norfolk steadiness of a man who had stood at the south porch of Bayfield Hall these 52 years past, inclined gravely and said in the plain Norfolk butler's manner that the house was at Miss Pelham's settled wish. Behind him in the cool, flagged south hall stood Mrs. Anstice, the housekeeper of 32 years' service, in plain plum bombazine, with the lace cap at the level Norfolk fashion, and the small brass household keys at her plain housekeeper's chatelaine, 56, plain plum bombazine, lace cap, and Mrs. Anstice curtsied in the Norfolk housekeeper's settled fashion, and said in the gentle Norfolk manner that the late Mrs. Honoria's small south chamber had been aired these 3 days past for Miss Pelham's coming. At Mrs. Anstice's right hand stood Mr. Pendlebury, the steward of 17 years' service, 62, weathered, plain dark coat, the small steward's day-book at the right pocket, and Mr. Pendlebury bowed in the level Norfolk steward's manner, and said in the plain Norfolk fashion that the home pasture and the 8-acre orchard and the poultry yard stood at Miss Pelham's settled wish. Mr. Camberwell, who had ridden over from Holt by the shorter lane to meet the chaise at the south porch, produced from his plain dark wool pocket-book the folded inventory at the green ribbon at the South Hall writing table beside the brass standish, and the inventory of the Bayfield estate, of the late Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham widow, of the late Sir Theodore Pelham 3rd Baronet, set out at the gentle italic of Mr. Camberwell's clerk, Mr. Trevenick, comprised the home pasture and the orchard and the walled garden of 178 acres of the Norfolk gentle ridge above the Glaven Valley. The South Library at the upper floor of the manor of 404 volumes, principally classical and historical, at the plain Norfolk shelves. The Pelham family plate of 92 pieces, marked Norwich, 1788, by the Norwich platemaker Mr. Sotterley, at the small plate room at the south kitchen passage, and the further sum of £3,500 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, standing in the late Mrs. Honoria's name at the testatrix's death. These comprised the whole of the real and personal estate at the south porch of Bayfield Hall at the cool Norfolk Tuesday afternoon of the 30th of November. From the gentle Norfolk ridge at the south windows of the upper floor, the Glaven Valley lay below at the cool November fall of the land in narrow ploughed brown stripes, and the small, thin, grey-silver Glaven River ran east through the willow-set meadows toward the small Norfolk coast at Clay by the Sea, and beyond the 4 miles of gentle Norfolk pasture. To the North Sea lay grey-silver at the cool horizon under the thin, clear November Norfolk sky, the small pale gulls turning at the cool wind off the sea above the gentle Norfolk pasture, and at the gentle west turn of the ridge, the small Norfolk pantile roofs of Bayfield village lay below at the lane in the warm Norfolk red-brown of the pantile under the gentle smoke of the village hearths, the small flint tower of St. Margaret's of Bayfield, rising plain and square at the village centre beside the gentle Norfolk lane. Henrietta, in plain, dark morning gabardine, walked south along the cool south kitchen wall at Mrs. Anstis's quiet right hand at the gentle late November afternoon light, and saw at the poultry yard the 6 Sussex Dorking hens settled at the cool Norfolk straw with their plain red combs, and the famous 5-toed feet at the gentle scratch of the November ground, and, at the further pen, the small new Polish crested foundation pair lately received from Sir John Seabright, Baronet, at Beechwood Park in October last, the Polish crested cock at the cool Norfolk penrail in the gentle, careful fashion, with his careful pale crest set fine above the level dark eye, and the Polish crested hen at his right hand at the straw. At the cool south parlour at the early Norfolk evening, Mrs. Anstis brought up in the gentle plum bombazine fashion the small worn green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham, the careful 9 years' breeding records of the Bayfield poultry yard at her late great-aunt's gentle italic from the first page of 1810 to the last page of the cool November 1819, 3 days before the testatrix's death, and laid it gentle on the plain Norfolk writing table at Miss Pelham's settled hand. At the cool Norfolk afternoon of the 4th of December, the 5th day of Henrietta's residence at Bayfield Hall, a small plain post-chaise drew up at the south porch, and a thin plain Norfolk clerk, in plain charcoal wool, with the plain leather folded pocket-book at the right hand, stepped down at the south step, and presented at Mr. Yelverton's small folded receiving tray a single plain Norwich-printed calling-card of cream pasteboard at the plain copper-plate engraving. Sir Mortimer Maddox, 4th Baronet, Maddox Hall, Norwich, together with a small folded note in plain charcoal ink at the plain Norfolk hand of Sir Mortimer's clerk, and the clerk, Mr. Tregaskis, thin grey, plain charcoal wool, said in the plain Norfolk clerk's manner that he stood at his master's instruction to leave at the south door of Bayfield Hall the preliminary calling card and the folded note announcing that Sir Mortimer Maddox of Maddox Hall, near Norwich, desired the favour of a private interview with Miss Pelham at Bayfield Hall on the Wednesday following at Mr. Maddox's convenience. Mr. Yelverton received the card and the folded note at the small folded receiving tray in the level Norfolk butler's fashion, and bowed gravely and carried them up the cool flagged south hall to the south parlour, where Henrietta sat at the plain Norfolk writing table with the late great-aunt's small green calf poultry journal opened at the October 1819 page, and the small plain dark morning sleeve at the gentle quiet of the cool afternoon, and Mr. Yelverton presented the small folded receiving tray at her plain right hand in the level Norfolk butler's manner. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, took up the plain cream pasteboard calling card and read the plain copper plate engraving in the level Norfolk fashion, and laid the card flat on the plain Norfolk writing table beside the poultry journal, then took up the small folded charcoal ink note, and read the plain Norfolk hand of Sir Mortimer's clerk in the gentle quiet of the cool afternoon, and laid the note flat at the right hand of the card, and said in the plain level, Norfolk fashion, to Mr. Yelverton, that the matter should be forwarded at the Evening Norfolk Post to Mr. Camberwell at Holt for his settled consideration. Mr. Yelverton inclined gravely in the plain Norfolk manner, and withdrew, and Henrietta at the plain Norfolk writing-table took up the plain quill and a clean sheet of plain Norfolk, laid paper, and wrote in the level Norfolk hand a small folded covering note to Mr. Camberwell at the market-place at Holt, enclosing the calling card of Sir Mortimer Maddox and the folded charcoal ink note of Mr. Tregaskis, and stating that she should be glad of Mr. Camberwell's settled counsel before the Wednesday following, and sealed the folded packet in plain Pelham crimson wax, with the small plain Pelham signet at her late father's gentle settled fashion, and laid the packet on the small South Hall salver for the Evening Norfolk post-boy, who at the gentle close of the cool November afternoon took it up at the south porch and rode west the 4 miles to Holt at the level Norfolk pace. On the cool Norfolk Sunday morning of the 5th of December, the first Sunday of Henrietta's residence at Bayfield Hall, and the second Sunday of Advent in the parish of Bayfield by Holt, Henrietta, in plain dark morning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Anstis's gentle right hand, the small quarter-mile down the cool Norfolk lane from the south porch of Bayfield Hall to the small flint tower of St. Margaret's of Bayfield at the village centre, and sat in the plain Pelham south pew at the second bay from the chancel in the level Norfolk Pelham fashion. Her late great-aunt, Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham, had kept all the 47 years of her Norfolk residence, and Reverend Sandys, in plain black gown at the small flint pulpit, preached the Advent 2 sermon at the gentle Norfolk text of the prophet Isaiah at the 11th chapter, and a little child shall lead them. In the patient, settled Norfolk pastoral fashion he had kept at the cure of Bayfield by Holt these 11 years past, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, heard the gentle Advent sermon at the second bay from the chancel, and at the gentle close of the service walked back at Mrs. Anstis's quiet right hand the small quarter-mile up the cool Norfolk lane to the south porch of Bayfield Hall in the thin clear December Norfolk light. That afternoon at the cool south parlour at Bayfield Hall, Henrietta sat at the plain Norfolk writing-table with the late great-aunt's small green-calf poultry journal opened at the cool, quiet hand, and worked patient through the 9 years of the Bayfield poultry yard breeding records, the Dorking Foundation flock, settled in the autumn of 1814, at Mrs. Honoria's gentle settled wish, the careful annual records of the Dorking hatches at the cool Norfolk spring, the gentle italic notes on the famous 5-toed feature at the second-year pullets, the small, careful 1815 note on the cool Norfolk straw at the south kitchen pen, and the gentle Norfolk fashion of the patient morning feed, the autumn 1816 settled correspondence with the small Norfolk fanciers at the Norwich Agricultural Show, the careful 1817 settled note on the Dorking cock's gentle Norfolk temperament at the cool winter run, the gentle 1818 notes on the small spangled Hamburg flock at the further pen, and the careful settled record of the small Norfolk pullets at the cool spring hatch, and at last the careful October 1819 entries in the late great-aunt's gentle italic on the foundation pair of Polish crested lately received from Sir John Sebright Baronet at Beechwood Park in Hertfordshire. The pages turned patient at Henrietta's level Norfolk hand at the cool quiet of the December afternoon, and at the cool fall of the early winter light at the plain south window, Mrs. Anstis brought up the small Norfolk parish tea at the plain Norfolk salver, and set it gentle at the right hand of the writing-table, and withdrew in the gentle settled plum bombazine fashion of the housekeeper's patient Norfolk service. At the cool Norfolk Monday morning of the 6th of December, Mr. Pendlebury walked with Miss Pelham the gentle 3/4 mile of the home pasture southeast at the cool Norfolk fall of the land, and pointed out at his plain steward's day-book the small flint sheepfold at the eastern corner of the pasture, and the small flint dovecote of the year 1748 at the south wall of the orchard, and the gentle Norfolk drainage of the small Glaven brook at the lower pasture. And Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, heard the patient steward's account, and made small, careful notes at the small green calf field book she had brought from the Holt parsonage cottage in her travelling case. Mr. Pendlebury named in the patient, settled Norfolk steward's fashion, the small careful tenants of the Bayfield estate, the small Norfolk tenant Mr. Threlkeld at the western Glaven cottage, and the small tenant Mr. Winford at the eastern Fold cottage, and the small Norfolk farrier Mr. Penhaligon at the village forge at Bayfield by Holt, and said in the gentle Norfolk fashion that each tenant had stood at the small Norfolk rent roll of the late Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham at the patient, settled Lady Day quarter for the 7 years past at his stewardship. At the cool Norfolk Monday afternoon, Mr. Camberwell rode over from Holt at the 4 miles east in the small plain, Norfolk chaise, and sat with Miss Pelham at the cool south parlour beside the plain Norfolk writing table, and considered the calling card of Sir Mortimer Maddox and the folded charcoal ink note of Mr. Tregaskis at the plain gold-rimmed spectacles in the patient, settled Norfolk solicitor's fashion, and said in the plain Norfolk manner that the matter of the Wednesday following at Sir Mortimer's convenience should be received at the South Library of Bayfield Hall in the level Norfolk composure Miss Pelham had kept at the chambers at Holt on the 23rd of November, that he should ride over himself from Holt at the cool Wednesday morning to stand at her right hand at the South Library, and that the small green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria Mary Pelham should lie open at the October 1819 page, at the writing table, at the cool Wednesday morning, at the South Library, at the gentle settled hand of the late great-aunt. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, heard Mr. Camberwell's settled counsel at the cool south parlour, and acquiesced at the gentle Norfolk fashion her late father had kept at the curacy of St. Andrew's of Holt, all the 8 years she had stood at his right hand at the parsonage cottage. At the cool Norfolk Tuesday morning of the 7th of December, Henrietta, in plain dark mourning gabardine, walked the small careful round of the south kitchen wall and the small poultry yard at the cool plain Norfolk straw, and Mr. Pendlebury at her right hand in plain dark coat, with the small steward's day-book at the right pocket, attended in the patient, settled Norfolk fashion. At the small poultry yard, Mr. Pendlebury produced from his plain dark wool pocket-book the small folded paper of the late Mrs. Honoria's careful October 1819 record of the foundation pair of Polish crested, received in the small Seabright basket at the south porch of Bayfield Hall on the Saturday morning of the 16th of October, 1819, 6 weeks before the testatrix's death at the cool November of 1819, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, took up the small folded paper at the gentle quiet of the cool morning, and read the patient settled hand of the late great-aunt at the careful Norfolk italic, and folded it gentle at her plain reticule beside the small green calf poultry journal. Mr. Pendlebury inclined gravely in the plain Norfolk steward's manner, and withdrew at the south kitchen passage. That afternoon, at the cool south parlour, at the gentle fall of the early winter light, Mrs. Anstice brought up at the small plain Norfolk salver the small folded letter of the steward, Mr. Pendlebury, attesting in the patient, settled Norfolk steward's hand that the Polish crested foundation pair had arrived in the small Seabright basket at the south porch of Bayfield Hall on the Saturday morning of the 16th of October, 1819, and that no Polish crested birds had stood at the Bayfield poultry yard at any prior date in the 7 years of his stewardship at Bayfield Hall, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, laid the small folded attestation gentle on the plain Norfolk writing table beside the late great-aunt's small green calf poultry journal and the small sobrite receipt of the 14th of October, 1819, in the patient, settled Norfolk fashion her late father had taught her at the curacy of St. Andrew's of Holt. The cool Norfolk light fell gentle at the plain south window of the south parlour, and the small grey-silver glimmer of the North Sea, 4 miles north, lay quiet at the cool December horizon beyond the gentle Norfolk pasture of the home estate. At the gentle close of the cool Norfolk Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Anstice brought up the small plain Norfolk parish tea at the plain Norfolk salver and set it gentle at the right hand of the writing table, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, took the small careful cup at the cool quiet of the south parlour, and considered at the gentle settled Norfolk fashion her late father had kept at the curacy of St. Andrew's of Holt, the matter of the Wednesday following at the South Library of Bayfield Hall at Sir Mortimer Maddox's convenience, and the small green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria, Mary Pelham, lay open at the patient, settled October 1819 page, at her plain right hand at the cool fall of the early December Norfolk evening. The Wednesday came on the 8th of December in level grey, Norfolk weather. The cold settled and quiet, the south lawn frosted at the verges, the box hedges along the south walk holding their winter green, the rooks at the 8-acre orchard quiet at the leafless branches, the smoke from the 3 brick chimneys of Bayfield rising in 3 thin columns into the still North Norfolk air. The home pasture beyond the south, ha-ha, lay quiet under the grey morning, and the flint dovecote at the south wall threw its small shadow square upon the gravel walk that led from the south porch around to the kitchen yard, where the Sussex dorking hens scratched at the frozen straw, and where, at the new pen at the south kitchen wall, the foundation pair of Polish crested from Beechwood Park took their careful, measured steps in the cold. Henrietta had risen at the appointed hour, and dressed in plain, unrelieved black morning gabardine, with the small jet brooch at the throat, and her soft fair hair plaited at the nape under the plain, dark morning cap. Mrs. Anstice had brought up the chocolate at the small mahogany table at the window of the south chamber, and Henrietta had taken it in level Norfolk composure, and had then descended to the South Library at the agreed appointment with Mr. Camberwell, who had ridden over from Holt the previous evening by the post-chaise and had taken his lodging at the East Passage. The Reverend Sandys had walked across from the parsonage of Bayfield by Holt at first light and had taken his place at the South Library. Mr. Pendlebury, the steward, stood at the small inner door in his plain weathered dark coat, with the long green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria already laid open at the writing table at the October 1819 page, and beside it the brass and leather portfolio of Mr. Camberwell, in which were the Sobrite receipt, the Holt Post wayslip, and the copy of Mrs. Honoria's last will and testament of October 20th, 1819, all in their careful order. Mr. Camberwell, 60, in plain dark wool with his gold-rimmed spectacles, rose at her entry and inclined his head, and the Reverend Sandys, 49, in plain black gown, rose also, and Henrietta took her place at the writing table at the high-backed walnut chair that faced the south windows. Beyond the casements, the home pasture sloped down to the Glaven Valley and the level Norfolk fields. Mr. Camberwell laid his hand upon the brass and leather portfolio at his side, and said, in his level Holt manner, that he had ridden over at her settled wish, and would speak only as called upon. And the Reverend Sandys said quietly that he would attend in the capacity of witness, as he had stood witness to the late Mrs. Honoria's will of October 20th last, and held himself ready for whatever the morning should require. Henrietta thanked them both in level Norfolk silence. She set her own small green calf poultry journal of the parsonage, years at her left hand, and the larger green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria at her right hand, the latter open at the October 1819 page, where the late great-aunt's careful settled italic recorded, in 8 clear lines, the receipt of the foundation pair of Polish crested birds from Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park in Hertfordshire, by the Holt post basket on the Thursday afternoon of the 14th of October, 1819. She set the small ivory pencil holder at the upper corner of the writing table, and folded her hands in her lap at the level Norfolk fashion of the parsonage at Holt, and she waited. At the appointed quarter of an hour, the gravel sweep at the south porch carried the sound of carriage wheels, and Mr. Yelverton, the butler, in his plain black tailcoat, withdrew to the south porch and returned at 3 minutes with the calling card upon the small silver salver of the late Sir Theodore. Mr. Camberwell looked once at Henrietta, and Henrietta inclined her head, and Mr. Yelverton showed in Sir Mortimer Maddox of Maddox Hall and his barrister Mr. Pringle of Norwich. Sir Mortimer Maddox, 57, stout, 5'10", gout-flushed primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile, entered first with the careful weight of a man who reckoned his standing in the room before his civility. Mr. Pringle, thin grey, charcoal wool, black portfolio, followed at 3 paces and bowed without warmth. They took the 2 walnut chairs that Mr. Yelverton drew forward at the writing-table opposite Henrietta, and Sir Mortimer set his small gold snuff-box at the polished walnut and folded his pudgy bee-ringed hands at the edge, and Mr. Pringle drew from his portfolio a folded paper sealed with a small dab of black wax and laid it flat upon the table between them. Sir Mortimer began at considerable length. He spoke of the long affection between the Maddox family near Norwich and the Pelham family of Bayfield, an affection running these 34 years since the marriage of his late aunt, Miss Maddox, to a second cousin of the late Sir Theodore Pelham in 1784. He spoke of his own attachment to the late Mrs. Honoria, whom he had attended these last 9 years at quarter-day visits from Maddox Hall, as a kinsman should, and as, he said with a small emphasis, no other had thought fit to do. He spoke of her long autumnal decline, and of his own settled conviction that her wishes, as expressed to him in private interview at Bayfield these last 14 months, had been other than those expressed in the will of October 20th last. Henrietta listened in level Norfolk composure. Mr. Camberwell sat with his gold-rimmed spectacles low upon his nose and made no remark. The Reverend Sandys at the bay window held his prayer-book closed at his lap. Sir Mortimer then came to the matter. He spoke, he said, of a parole trust declared by the late Mrs. Honoria in the October of 1818 over the grain rights at the home pasture of Bayfield Hall, those grain rights being, by the customary Norfolk usage, the rent in kind of wheat and barley at the Michaelmas and Lady Day quarter days from the home pasture of 178 acres, payable to the holder of the trust at half the going Norwich corn market rate, and the trust declared by his late kinswoman, he said, in his own favour, by spoken word, at private interview at the south porch of Bayfield, on a settled afternoon in the October of 1818. The trust, he said, had been declared in the presence of no third party, but his memory of the words spoken was clear and settled, and Mr. Pringle had reduced the substance of those words to writing within 3 days, in proper barrister's hand, and held the memorandum at his chambers in Norwich these 14 months past. Mr. Pringle inclined his thin grey head and tapped the folded paper at the table. Sir Mortimer drew breath. He had come, he said, to lay the matter before Miss Pelham, that it might be settled at amicable composition between kin without recourse to the Norwich assizes, and that the half-share of the grain rights at the home pasture might pass to him at the next Lady Day quarter day by the late Mrs. Honoria's settled wish of October 1818, as declared at the private interview that had then taken place. Mr. Camberwell raised his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful half-inch upon his nose. He inquired, in level Holt courtesy, at what particular place upon the Bayfield estate the said private interview of October 1818 had taken place, and whether Sir Mortimer would be so good as to state the date and the particulars. Sir Mortimer flushed at the question, but answered with the weight of a man who had rehearsed his answer. The private interview, he said, had taken place at the Bayfield poultry yard at the south kitchen wall, at the late great-aunt's invitation, on the Wednesday afternoon of the 16th of September, 1818. He had been at Bayfield those 3 days at the autumn visit, and his kinswoman had walked him through the south kitchen yard, and at the poultry yard she had drawn him aside at the new pen, and had spoken the words of the trust, and he had seen, he said with his own 2 eyes, the new Polish crested cockerels she had been breeding at the Bayfield poultry yard these 3 years past, and had then spoken of the grain rights at the home pasture, and her settled wish at the October quarter as to the disposition of the half-share thereof. Sir Mortimer leaned back at his walnut chair and folded his pudgy hands at the gold and claret silk of his waistcoat. Mr. Pringle drew the folded paper a careful half-inch closer. Henrietta sat in level Norfolk silence for the space of 3 measured breaths. Then she set her hand upon the open page of the late Mrs. Honoria's Poultry Journal of October 1819 at her right, and she said, in the level Holt fashion her late father, the Reverend Augustus, had taught her at the parsonage of Holt, that she would address each point in the order in which Sir Mortimer had set it out. Mr. Camberwell folded his hands upon the writing-table. Henrietta turned the larger green calf Poultry Journal a careful 1/4 of an inch and lifted the small ivory pencil-holder away, that the open page might be seen at the full. The page was Mrs. Honoria's own gentle settled italic in iron gall ink upon the soft cream paper of the journal, dated at the upper margin Thursday afternoon, October 14th, 1819. The 8 clear lines recorded, in the careful settled fashion of the late great-aunt's 9-year poultry journal, the receipt at the south kitchen yard of Bayfield Hall, by the Holt post-basket of the afternoon, of 1 foundation pair of Polish crested fowl from Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park in Hertfordshire, in good condition after the carriage from Watford, the cock at 5 months and the hen at 4 months and 3 weeks, the payment of £4 and 10 shillings made by Holt, bank draft at the basketman's hand, and the receipt of Sir John Seabright, Baronet, held by the steward Mr. Pendlebury at the steward's room. Henrietta read the page aloud at the level Holt, pace her late father had taught her. She read it once, and then she paused, and then she read it a second time at the same level pace, that there should be no mistake at the particulars. Mr. Camberwell then drew from his brass and leather portfolio at his side the original receipt of Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park, in Sir John's own settled hand, dated at the upper margin 14th October, 1819 at Beechwood Park, Hertfordshire, and signed at the lower margin in the careful settled signature of the Seabright Bantam's developer himself. The receipt recorded the payment of £4 and 10 shillings, received of Mrs. Honoria Pelham of Bayfield Hall, Norfolk, by Holt bank draft at the basketman's hand, in full settlement of 1 foundation pair of Polish crested fowl, dispatched the same afternoon by the Watford to Holt post basket, the cock and the hen, each of the early 1819 hatch at Beechwood Park. Mr. Camberwell laid the Seabright receipt at the writing-table at Henrietta's right hand, beside the open page of the late Mrs. Honoria's Poultry Journal, and he set his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful half-inch lower upon his nose, and he said nothing. Henrietta then turned her grey eyes to the small inner door, at which Mr. Pendlebury the steward stood in his plain weathered dark coat, and she asked him, in level Norfolk courtesy, whether he would be so good as to state to the company at the South Library writing-table the manner of the Polish crested arrival at Bayfield Hall in the October of last. Mr. Pendlebury stepped forward 2 careful paces and took his place at the corner of the writing table opposite the Reverend Sandys, and he spoke in level Norfolk, Holtside manner. The Polish-crested foundation pair, he said, had arrived at Bayfield Hall on the Saturday afternoon of the 16th of October, 1819, by the Holt post-basket, carried from Holt to the south porch in the small wicker basket marked at the lid in Sir John Seabright's settled hand. He had himself received the basket from the Holt basketman, and had carried it round to the south kitchen yard, and had set the foundation pair at the new pen the late Mrs. Honoria had caused to be built at the south kitchen wall the week before, in expectation of the Seabright basket. He had paid out the £4 and 10 shillings at the Holt basketman's hand by the bank draft of the late Mrs. Honoria upon the Gurney's Bank at Holt, and had received the Seabright receipt, and had set it at the small steward's strong box, where it had remained these 8 weeks past, until he had brought it that morning at Mr. Camberwell's request. He paused, drew breath, and added that no Polish crested fowl of any age or description had ever been at Bayfield Hall before the Saturday afternoon of the 16th of October, 1819. He had been steward at Bayfield since the November of 1796, 23 years past, and he knew the poultry yard in every settled detail of its breeding stock, and the late Mrs. Honoria's poultry yard had held, these many years before October last, only the 6 Sussex Dorking hens of the 1814 strain, the 6 Spangled Hamburg hens of the 1816 strain, the 6 Old English game hens of the 1813 strain, and the small Norfolk cockerels appertaining, and no Polish crested of any variety had been at any part of the Bayfield estate until the 16th of October last, when the Seabright foundation pair had arrived in the Holt post-basket. Mr. Pendlebury took a step back at the small inner door and folded his weathered hands at his sides. The South Library held its quiet at the level Norfolk fashion of the December noonday. The clock at the chimney-piece, a small carved walnut-cased clock of the Norwich maker Wilkin, set at the chimney-piece by the late Sir Theodore in 1788, ticked at its level walnut pace, and the small coal fire at the chimney-piece settled at its own small grey ashes, and the grey winter light at the south casements held its level Norfolk hand upon the writing-table and upon the papers laid out thereon. Henrietta then set her hand upon the green calf cover of the larger poultry journal at her right, and upon the Seabright receipt that lay beside it, and she said the words that the Bible of the trait had taught her at the 8th surfacing beat: Sir Mortimer. The Polish crested birds did not enter the Bayfield poultry yard until the 14th of October, 1819, by the Seabright receipt at this writing table. The September, 1818. You name is 14 months prior. The matter you set out cannot have been at the date you set it out. The words were spoken at the level Norfolk pace of the parsonage at Holt. The words were spoken once, and the words were not repeated. Sir Mortimer sat very still at the walnut chair. The gout flush at his thick neck rose 2 careful shades, then sank away at the same careful rate, and the pudgy bee-ringed hands at the silk waistcoat unfolded and laid themselves flat upon the writing-table. The oily smile fell away by stages, the gold snuff-box went unhandled, and the eyes turned from the poultry journal to the Seabright receipt, and from the receipt to the level grey eyes of Henrietta across the writing-table, and from her to the small inner door where Mr. Pendlebury stood, and back to the open page of the poultry journal, and at the 3rd such circuit the heavy shoulders sank, and the breath went out of Sir Mortimer Maddox. He did not speak. He did not raise his hands. He did not reach for the folded paper at the centre of the writing-table. Mr. Pringle looked once at his client, once at the open page of the poultry journal, and once at the Seabright receipt of October 14th, 1819. He drew the folded paper back into his black portfolio without breaking the small dab of black wax, closed the portfolio at its small brass clasp, and set it at the floor at his feet. He inclined his thin grey head 3 careful inches to Henrietta, and said, in the settled fashion of the Norwich bar, that he begged leave to withdraw from the matter, that it could not be sustained at the Norwich Assizes nor at any tribunal of the King's Bench, and that he held himself bound by the courtesies of the present conference to so state. He inclined his head at Mr. Camberwell and at the Reverend Sandys, and stood at his chair, and waited a careful half-minute for Sir Mortimer, who did not rise. Mr. Camberwell folded his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful quarter-inch lower upon his nose, and turned his level halt gaze to Henrietta at the high-backed walnut chair. He inclined his head 3 careful inches, in the level halt courtesy of the market-place chambers, and he spoke the words that the level Norfolk afternoon had set upon him. "Miss Pelham, the matter is settled. The Polish crested has settled it." The Reverend Sandys at the bay window inclined his head also, and the prayer book at his lap was set a careful quarter of an inch nearer the centre of his lap, and he said nothing at all, for the matter at the South Library writing table needed nothing further to be said. Henrietta sat in level Norfolk silence at the high-backed walnut chair for the space of 7 measured breaths. Then she rose from the walnut chair, and she walked the 3 careful paces to the small inner door, at which Mr. Pendlebury the steward stood in his plain weathered dark coat, and she thanked him in level Norfolk courtesy for his careful statement at the writing table, and Mr. Pendlebury inclined his weathered head 3 careful inches, and withdrew at the small inner door to the steward's room beyond. She then walked the 3 careful paces back to the high-backed walnut chair at the writing table and stood beside it, and she turned her level grey eyes upon Sir Mortimer at the walnut chair opposite, and she said, in the level halt fashion of the parsonage, that she would not detain him further at the South Library at the present hour, and that Mr. Yelverton would attend him at the south porch at his settled convenience. Sir Mortimer rose at last. The gout flush had not returned, and the oily smile had not returned, and the gold snuff-box went into the pudgy hand without ceremony. He inclined his head 3 careful inches at Henrietta, in a gesture that was less a courtesy than the settled acknowledgment of a matter ended. He inclined his head at Mr. Camberwell and at the Reverend Sandys, and turned at the south casements and walked the 7 careful paces to the South Library door, and Mr. Pringle followed 3 paces behind him with the black portfolio at his side. Mr. Yelverton, the butler, attended at the south porch and showed them to the carriage at the gravel sweep. The carriage wheels carried away at the level grey gravel, and at the level grey Norfolk frost at the verges of the south sweep, and the small, clear winter sound of the wheels diminished at the south avenue, and was lost at the line of the leafless lime trees that ran the half-mile from the south porch to the lodge gate at the Holt Road. From the south windows of the South Library, Henrietta watched the small carriage diminish at the level grey avenue, and at the lodge gate the small carriage turned south-west at the Holt Road, and the wheels were lost at the level grey Norfolk distance. She turned from the south windows then. The South Library at the level grey winter light was as it had been at the 8th of December morning. The small coal fire at the chimney-piece, the walnut-cased clock of the Norwich maker Wilkin at the chimney-piece, the high-backed walnut chair at the writing-table, the green-calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria at the right of the writing-table, the Seabright receipt of 14th October 1819 at the centre of the writing-table, the small ivory pencil-holder at the upper corner. Mr. Camberwell rose from his walnut chair at the writing-table at last, and he removed his gold-rimmed spectacles and folded them at the spectacle case at his waistcoat pocket. He inclined his head at the level halt, courtesy at Henrietta, and he said in the level halt manner that he had not, at his 38 years' practice at the market-place chambers at Holt, seen a parole trust claim laid before a writing-table and laid out at the same writing-table at so settled a quarter of an hour as the present, and that the matter would not return at the Norwich Assizes at any season of the year, for Mr. Pringle was a barrister of long-settled practice, and would not be brought to lay a matter before the King's Bench that had been laid out at a Bayfield writing-table at the Polish crested, settled fashion of the present morning. He folded the Seabright receipt at the careful single fold along the original crease, and he returned the Seabright receipt to the brass and leather portfolio at his side, and he set the brass and leather portfolio at the small mahogany side table at the bay window, that Henrietta might add the receipt to the poultry journal at her settled convenience. The Reverend Sandys at the bay window rose from his small walnut chair also. He inclined his head at the level Bayfield curate's manner at Henrietta, and he said quietly that he would have stood witness at the present writing table at the same level fashion as he had stood witness at the late Mrs. Honoria's will at the south parlour of Bayfield Hall on the 20th of October last, and that the settled fashion of the late Mrs. Honoria at the long autumnal decline of her last weeks had been the settled fashion of the writing table at the present hour, and that he held himself ready at the parsonage of Bayfield by Holt at any further matter Henrietta should wish to bring before him in the lay capacity or in the clerical, at her settled convenience. He gathered his prayer book at his black gown, and inclined his head a second careful 3 inches, and withdrew at the south library door to the long passage, and at the long passage to the south porch, and at the south porch to the gravel sweep, and at the gravel sweep to the half-mile lane that ran from Bayfield Hall to the parsonage of Bayfield by Holt, at the southeast corner of the home pasture. Henrietta stood at the south library window a careful 3 minutes after the Reverend Sandys had withdrawn. The level grey Norfolk light at the south casements was the level grey Norfolk light of the parsonage of Holt at the December afternoons of her own 24 years of careful settled observation at the south window of the parsonage cottage. The level grey Norfolk light had been the same at the parsonage of Holt at her father's reading table at the December afternoons of his last winter of 1817, and the level grey Norfolk light was the same at the South Library of Bayfield Hall at the present afternoon of the 8th of December, 1819, at the writing table at which her own hand had laid out the Polish crested receipt at the careful, settled fashion her late great-aunt's 9-year poultry journal had taught her, and at which the matter of Sir Mortimer Maddox of Maddox Hall had been laid out and settled at the same careful, settled fashion at the same writing table. She turned at last from the south library window. Mr. Camberwell stood at the small mahogany side table at the bay window, his brass and leather portfolio under his arm, in the level Holt manner of his 38 years' practice. Mrs. Anstice, the housekeeper, 56, in her lace cap and plum bombazine, had come up at the level Norfolk fashion to the south library door at the long passage, and stood at the threshold with the level grey Norfolk gravity of the Bayfield housekeeper of 32 years' service. She inclined her lace-capped head at Henrietta, and said in the level Norfolk fashion that the cold luncheon was set at the small breakfast parlour at the half-hour at Henrietta's settled convenience, that Mr. Camberwell might take a careful plate before the post-chaise at Holt, and that Mr. Pendlebury, the steward, had returned to the steward's room with the Seabright receipt in his careful charge for the strong box. Henrietta thanked her in level Norfolk courtesy. She walked the 7 careful paces from the south library window to the writing table, and she closed the green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria at the October 1819 page, and she set the small ivory pencil holder at the upper corner of the journal, and she laid her hand a careful 3 seconds upon the green calf cover at the careful settled fashion of the parsonage at Holt. She set her own small green calf poultry journal at the parsonage, years beside the larger journal at the right of the writing table, and the 2 journals lay together at the level grey afternoon light of the south library at the level Norfolk fashion in which the late great-aunt's 9 years and the great-niece's 4 years had at last come to lie at the same writing table. She walked then with Mr. Camberwell at the long passage to the south porch, and at the south porch she thanked him in level Norfolk courtesy for his careful settled attendance at the writing table at the morning, and Mr. Camberwell inclined his head at the level Holt manner, and said in his level Holt fashion that he held himself bound at the market-place chambers at Holt at any further settled matter Henrietta should wish to bring before him at the December weeks of the present winter, and that he would write at the proper post on the Friday following with his careful settled memorandum of the morning's interview as a matter for the Bayfield strong-box. He inclined his head a second, careful 3 inches at Henrietta at the south porch, and he stepped at the post-chaise at the gravel-sweep, and the post-chaise carried him away at the South Avenue and at the lodge gate of Bayfield Hall, and at the 4-mile Holt Road, and the level grey Norfolk afternoon settled at the south porch of Bayfield Hall, as the level grey Norfolk afternoon had settled at the south porch of Bayfield Hall at every quarter-day of the past 47 years. Henrietta returned at the long passage to the south library. She took her place at the high-backed walnut chair at the writing-table. She drew the green calf poultry journal of the late Mrs. Honoria a careful half-inch nearer at the right of the writing-table, and she opened it again at the October 1819 page at which the foundation pair of Polish crested had been recorded by Mrs. Honoria's gentle settled italic on the Thursday afternoon of the 14th of October, 1819. She took up the small ivory-handled pen at the small porcelain inkwell at the upper corner of the writing-table, and she dipped the careful settled point at the iron gall ink, and at the foot of the October 1819 page, in the level Norfolk Holt side, italic her late father, the Reverend Augustus, had taught her at the parsonage of Holt, she added, in 8 careful settled lines, the settled fashion of the Bayfield Poultry Journal at the close of the matter. The foundation pair, Polish crested at the south kitchen wall, received Bayfield Saturday afternoon, 16th October, 1819 by Holt Post Basket, Sir John Seabright, Baronet of Beechwood Park, Hertfordshire. £4 10 paid by Holt Bank Draft. Receipt at the strong box at the steward's room. Sir Mortimer Maddox of Maddox Hall, having claimed at private interview at the South Library this Wednesday afternoon, December 8th, 1819, a parole trust at the late Mrs. Honoria's hand at the home pasture grain rights of October 1818, grounded at the Polish crested cockerels at the Bayfield Poultry Yard at the September 1818, the Polish crested foundation pair not having entered the Bayfield Poultry Yard until the said Saturday 16th October 1819 by the Seabright receipt at this writing table, the matter is settled at the present writing table by the Polish crested receipt, as Mr. Camberwell of Holt has this afternoon at this writing table observed by Henrietta Pelham, this 8th of December 1819 at the South Library of Bayfield Hall. She blotted the careful settled italic with the small blotting pad at the writing table, and she closed the green calf poultry journal at the careful settled October 1819 page, and she set the small ivory-handled pen at the small porcelain inkwell at the upper corner of the writing table, and she folded her hands at her lap at the high-backed walnut chair, and she sat in level Norfolk silence at the South Library writing table at the level grey Norfolk afternoon of the 8th of December at Bayfield Hall, in the careful settled fashion of the parsonage of Holt, at which her late father, the Reverend Augustus, had taught her to keep the careful settled hand at the close of any settled matter, and at the careful settled fashion of the late great-aunt at the South Library of Bayfield Hall, at the long autumnal decline of her last weeks. The level grey Norfolk afternoon settled at the south casements, and the small coal fire at the chimney-piece settled at its own small grey ashes, and the walnut-cased clock of the Norwich maker Wilkin settled at its level walnut pace, and the matter of Sir Mortimer Maddox of Maddox Hall at Bayfield Hall was settled at the writing table. The mid-December days at Bayfield settled into a level Norfolk rhythm that Henrietta Pelham, in her quiet, unrelieved, black, mourning gabardine and plain dark cap, kept with the same patient composure she had carried at the Holt parsonage cottage these 8 years past. Morning brought the south window reading hour at the South Library with the 404 volumes of the late great-aunt's catalogue at her left hand and the small green calf poultry journal at her right. Forenoon brought the careful round of the south kitchen wall and the poultry yard where the 6 Sussex Dorking hens scratched at the lime-washed brick, and the foundation pair of Polish crested birds kept their careful crests turned out of the East Anglian damp. Midday brought the cold collation at the small south parlour, with Mrs. Anstice, the housekeeper, in plum bombazine and lace cap, setting down the brown Norfolk bread and the cold pressed tongue without remark. Afternoon brought the household ledger at the steward's small writing table. Evening brought the South Library again, the candle at the green baize, and the careful italic of the poultry journal page. The home pasture beyond the south windows lay in level brown Norfolk winter, the Glaven Valley below in its quiet grey, the North Sea 4 miles north, grey-silver under the close pewter sky, the Norfolk pan-tile roofs of Bayfield Village west in their settled patient huddle. After the South Library hours of the first January week, Henrietta engaged Miss Faith Anstice, Mrs. Anstice's niece of 24 years, soft brown hair plaited, plain dark wool, level Norfolk speech, as reading companion at the small south parlour each forenoon. The parish school at the brick schoolroom behind St. Margaret's of Bayfield by Holt had been at the late great-aunt's quiet quarter-day patronage these 5 years past, and at the second January Sunday, Reverend Sandys, in his plain black gown, asked at the south porch whether Miss Pelham might keep the patronage and the reading hour for the 6 village girls each Tuesday afternoon at the south parlour at Bayfield. Henrietta acquiesced in the level Norfolk fashion. The 6 girls were Patient Sandys at 12 years the curate's eldest, Damaris Anstice at 11, the housekeeper's grandniece, Letitia Pendlebury, at 11, the steward's youngest, Hetty Cromer at 10, of the Cromer Village blacksmith's house, Bryony Yelverton at 10, the butler's niece, and Sophie Camberwell at 9, the Holt solicitor's youngest daughter, sent over each Tuesday in Mr. Camberwell's gig. They sat in a careful half-circle at the small south parlour with their plain print frocks and white pinafores and their copied passages on slate, and Henrietta at the level Norfolk pace read aloud from Cowper's Yardley Oak and from Maria Edgeworth's Harry and Lucy, the small green volumes Mr. Camberwell had brought over by post in the second week, the girls following the page in their careful turn. The parish school poultry day was settled by the 3rd Saturday in January at the South Poultry Yard at the South Kitchen Wall, where the 6 girls came up the lane from the brick schoolroom each Saturday forenoon in their plain print frocks and white pinafores, and gathered at the lime-washed brick pen wall in level Norfolk attention. Henrietta, in her plain dark mourning gabardine, and Miss Faith at her elbow, walked them along the careful round, naming each Dorking hen by the green calf journal: Pevensey, Petworth, Pulborough, Plumpton, Patcham, Polegate, and showing the girls in turn the famous 5-toed feature of the Sussex Dorking that no other table fowl in the kingdom carried, the careful 5th small toe set back at the heel of the foot. The girls leaned in at the lime-washed brick and counted the toes in their level Norfolk wonder. The spangled Hamburg pair at the second pen kept their black and white spangled feathers in the careful Lancashire pattern. The Old English gamecock at the third pen kept his careful upright bearing, and the foundation pair of Polish crested at the new 4th pen kept their careful tufted crests dry under the small pent roof Henrietta had had Mr. Pendlebury set up against the East Anglian damp in the 1st January week. The girls drew the Polish crested cock in turn at the small drawing slate Miss Faith set on the brick wall for them, the careful crest above the careful eye, the careful upright Polish crested stance in their patient schoolroom pencils, and Henrietta walked among them with her level Norfolk word of approval at each careful slate. Patience Sandys at 12 drew the careful crest with the careful patient curate's daughter's hand, and Letitia Pendlebury at 11 drew the careful upright stance with the careful steward's daughter's eye for limb, and Bryony Yelverton at 10 drew the careful Polish crested eye in the careful upright Polish crested setting with the careful butler's niece's quiet schoolroom patience. Sophie Camberwell at 9 drew the careful crest at twice the careful proportion of the careful body in the careful solicitor's youngest daughter's settled enthusiasm, and Henrietta in level Norfolk composure showed her the careful proportion at the careful slate edge in the level Norfolk fashion. The girls kept the careful drawings in their careful slate cases at the brick schoolroom each Saturday afternoon, for Miss Faith to set out at the careful reading hour the following Tuesday afternoon at the small south parlour, where the careful Polish crested slates lay set at the careful slate rail above the careful brick hob in the careful Norfolk fashion. Mr. Pendlebury the steward, weathered in his plain dark coat, walked the home pasture with Henrietta on the third Wednesday in February to set the spring sowing of the south 5-acre field at oats and the north 7-acre at barley in the careful Norfolk 4-course rotation his late master Sir Theodore had settled at Bayfield in 1772. The careful clover and turnip lay at the careful east 6-acre, and the careful winter wheat at the careful west 8-acre, at the careful patient Norfolk pace the steward had kept these 47 years past. Mrs. Anstice at the South Library brick hob kept the careful Norfolk kettle each forenoon at the level Norfolk fashion she had kept at Bayfield these 32 years past, and the careful brown Norfolk tea-caddy at the small writing table stood at the careful Norfolk patience of the careful Bayfield household. Miss Faith Anstice at the small south parlour, reading lectern at the careful forenoon hour, read aloud at the careful Norfolk pace from the small green Edgeworth volume, or from the careful Cowper octavo, and Henrietta in level Norfolk composure at the small writing table by the south window kept her quiet Norfolk hand at the careful green calf poultry journal page. On Wednesday the 22nd of March in the forenoon at the South Library, with the early Norfolk spring at the south windows and the home pasture turning to its first pale green, and Mrs. Anstice at the brick hob keeping the careful kettle, Henrietta took down from the second shelf at the south wall the worn brown calf Pelham family commonplace book her late great-aunt had kept at the South Library these many years past, in its plain Norfolk brown calf binding, lately rubbed at the spine, and opened it at the green baize. The first page in the gentle, careful italic of Mrs. Honoria Pelham was dated the 14th of May, 1772, and read, in the patient Norfolk hand, Henrietta now knew from the poultry journal of 9 years and from the half-correspondence in Mr. Camberwell's keeping. Sir Theodore this day settled at the south kitchen wall the first 6 Sussex Dorking hens of the Bayfield poultry yard, the foundation pair come over from Petworth in the Sussex carrier's basket, the cock with the careful 5-toed feature of the breed, the hens of the careful grey and cream Dorking marking. Henrietta turned the leaf at the green baize, and the next page kept the same careful italic, and the next, and the next. For the late great-aunt had kept at Bayfield since her marriage to Sir Theodore Pelham in 1772. Her own careful poultry journal of 47 years at the South Library commonplace book, Dorking and Spangled Hamburg and Old English game breeding records in the gentle italic of the Norfolk hand, the careful Petworth foundation pair of 1772, the careful Lancashire Spangled Hamburg pair, come over from Bolton in 1786, the careful Old English gamecock from the Norwich market in 1793, the careful breeding pairs and the careful hatch counts, and the careful winter losses, and the careful spring renewals, all in the patient Norfolk italic page by page, year by year, quarter day by quarter day. Henrietta turned the careful leaves at the green baize, and the trait squared upon her quiet across the 47 years of Bayfield poultry keeping she had not known her great-aunt had kept. The great-aunt she had never met had been at the South Poultry Yard, at the careful Norfolk fancier's labour, these 47 years past, at the same careful breeds, in the same careful Norfolk italic. Henrietta had been keeping at the Holt parsonage hen-house, these 5 years past, and the careful Sir Bright correspondence of 1818 and 1819 at the late great-aunt's last hand had been the close of the careful 47 years Norfolk labour the great-aunt had been at quietly. All the days Henrietta at Holt had been at her own. Henrietta turned the careful leaves through to the last entry at the patient italic at the centre of the commonplace book, dated the 9th of November 1819, 3 days before Mrs. Honoria Pelham had departed this life at Bayfield Hall. And the entry in the gentle Norfolk italic read, "The Polish crested foundation pair, received from Sir John Seabright, B.T., at Beechwood Park in October. Last keep their crests dry at the South Pent roof at the new 4th pen, and have settled to the East Anglian damp, better than I had thought. The cock at the careful upright Polish crested stance, and the hen at the careful Polish crested setting. I hope at the careful spring hatching of 1820, the careful Seabright correspondence shall be kept on by another hand at Bayfield, and the careful Polish crested at the South Poultry Yard, and the careful Norfolk fancier's labour at the South Kitchen Wall, in the level Norfolk fashion the Pelham family has kept all its days." Henrietta closed the worn brown calf commonplace book at the green baize at the patient Norfolk close, and stood in level Norfolk silence at the south library window. The early Norfolk spring lay at the home pasture, and the first pale green at the south kitchen wall, and the careful poultry yard at the lime-washed brick, and beyond the home pasture, the careful Glaven Valley in its quiet grey-green, and the careful North Sea 4 miles north, grey-silver under the patient pewter sky. Mrs. Anstice at the brick hob did not speak. Henrietta stood at the south library window for the space of 10 quiet minutes in the careful Norfolk silence she had kept all her days. She took the green calf poultry journal from the writing table and opened it at the central crease, and copied into her own gentle, careful italic the first 1772 entry of the late great-aunt at Bayfield, Sir Theodore. This day settled at the South Kitchen Wall the first 6 Sussex Dorking hens of the Bayfield poultry yard, the foundation pair come over from Petworth in the Sussex carrier's basket, the cock with the careful 5-toed feature of the breed, the hens of the careful grey and cream Dorking marking. She set the careful date at the green baize, Wednesday the 22nd of March 1820, copied by Henrietta Pelham at the South Library at Bayfield. She closed the green calf poultry journal at the careful central crease, and set the worn brown calf commonplace book on the second shelf at the south wall again, at the careful Norfolk patients the great-aunt had kept these 47 years past, and Mrs. Anstice at the brick hob in level Norfolk composure, poured out the careful brown Norfolk tea at the small writing table without remark. Henrietta took the careful Norfolk cup at her quiet Norfolk hand, and drank in level Norfolk silence at the south library window, the careful early Norfolk spring at the home pasture, and the careful first pale green at the south kitchen wall, and the careful Glaven Valley below in its quiet grey-green, and the careful North Sea 4 miles north, grey-silver under the careful pewter sky, and the careful trait of the 47 Bayfield years lay quiet at the green baize behind her, at the careful patient Norfolk italic of the late great-aunt's hand. On Saturday the 25th of March, at Lady Day quarter day, in the forenoon, Mr. Pendlebury, the steward in his plain dark coat, brought up the careful Lady Day accounts at the small writing table at the South Library, the rents of the 7 small Bayfield holdings at the careful Norfolk quarter-day tally: Glarven Cottage at £1 12s, the careful East Tenant Cottage at £1 4, the careful West Tenant Cottage at £1 4, the careful Leatheringset Lane Cottage at £1 6, the careful Bayfield Village Smithy at £2, the careful Bayfield Village Bakery at £1 10, and the careful Home Pasture Shepherd's Cottage at 6 shillings rent-free at the careful Norfolk Shepherd's Wage. And Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, read and signed each careful page. In the second week of April, Mrs. Anstice, the housekeeper, brought up at the small south parlour the careful flat morocco case of the Pelham family pearls. The 92-piece plate marked Norwich 1788, having been kept since the careful spring polishing at the careful Bayfield plate room, and showed Henrietta the long single strand of careful Norfolk pearls the late Sir Theodore had given Mrs. Honoria at Norwich in 1788 at the same Norwich silversmith's hand as the plate, the careful single strand of careful North Norfolk pearls at the careful Norwich silver clasp at the careful Norwich 1788 hallmark of the careful Norwich goldsmith, Mr. Reuben Camplin, at the careful Norwich marketplace. Henrietta set the careful flat morocco case at the South Library lower drawer in the level Norfolk fashion. On Wednesday the 12th of April, at the small South Parlour reading hour, the 6 parish schoolgirls in their plain print frocks and white pinafores presented at Henrietta's hand a small Norfolk wildflower album of careful pressed celandine and pressed Norfolk primrose and pressed lady smock at the green schoolroom paper. They had pressed these 3 weeks past at Miss Faith's settled wish. The careful album bound at the careful brown paper, at the careful schoolroom ribbon, at the careful Norfolk patience of the 6 careful schoolroom hands, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, gave to each girl in turn a small green calf copy of Aesop's fables Mr. Camberwell had sent over from the Holt bookseller. Mr. Brettingham at her settled wish 2 days before. The careful small green calf volumes set in level Norfolk order at the small south parlour, reading lectern at the careful Tuesday forenoon hand of Miss Faith Anstice. In the 3rd week of April, with the careful Norfolk spring at the home pasture and the first early Norfolk celandine at the south kitchen wall, Mrs. Anstice, in level Norfolk composure, brought up to Henrietta the question of the half-mourning ease into half-mourning at the careful 5-month mark from the late Mrs. Pelham's settled wish, and Henrietta acquiesced. The careful cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin gowns Mrs. Leatheringset, the village dressmaker, had been at since the 2nd February week were brought up from the linen press at the South Chamber. Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April, 1820, broke at Bayfield in a cool, clear Norfolk morning of careful pale blue sky and careful pale gold light at the south kitchen wall and careful early celandine at the lime-washed brick of the south poultry yard. Henrietta dressed at the small south chamber in the cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin morning gown Mrs. Leatheringset had finished the careful Thursday before. The careful cream and grey sprig of careful Norfolk celandine at the level Norfolk bodice, her soft fair hair plaited at the nape under a plain cream Norfolk straw bonnet with a plain grey ribbon, her plain cream Norfolk gloves at her quiet Norfolk hands, and walked down to the south porch with Miss Faith Anstice at her elbow, and Mrs. Anstice 3 paces behind. The careful Bayfield carriage took them the careful 3/4 mile along the careful Norfolk lane to St. Margaret's of Bayfield by Holt at the careful Norfolk pace. Reverend Sandys, in his plain black gown at the careful south porch, received Miss Pelham in level Norfolk welcome. The careful Bayfield congregation in their plain Sunday wool at the careful Norfolk pews kept their level Norfolk attention. The careful Bayfield ringers at the careful Flint Tower kept the careful Easter peal at the careful Norfolk pace, the careful 6 bells of St. Margaret's at the careful patient Norfolk descent, the careful Flint and Pantile Parish Church in its careful Norfolk light. The Easter service was read in level Norfolk composure. the careful Norfolk responses at the careful Norfolk pace, the careful Easter collect at the patient Norfolk italic of the Book of Common Prayer, the careful Easter sermon at Reverend Sandys's plain Norfolk pulpit on the careful Easter text from St. John the 20th at the early Norfolk morning at the careful empty sepulchre. The 6 parish school girls in their plain Sunday print frocks and white pinafores at the careful Bayfield North pew kept the careful Norfolk responses at the level Norfolk pace, and Mrs. Anstis the housekeeper in plum bombazine and lace cap at the careful South Aisle pew kept the level Norfolk fashion she had kept at St. Margaret's these 32 years past. Henrietta, in her cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin at the careful Bayfield pew, kept the level Norfolk fashion she had kept all her days. The careful Easter hymn at the careful Flint nave was sung in level Norfolk fashion by the careful Bayfield congregation at the careful Norfolk pace, and the careful Easter blessing at Reverend Sandys's plain Norfolk hand was given over the careful patient Bayfield congregation in the level Norfolk fashion the parish had kept these many years past. After service, the careful Bayfield congregation gathered in level Norfolk converse at the careful South Porch in the cool, clear Norfolk morning under the careful pale blue sky and the careful pale gold light at the careful flint and brick South Porch wall. Reverend Sandys, in his plain black gown at the careful South Porch step, turned to Henrietta in level Norfolk composure and brought up to her quiet Norfolk hand a tall, lean gentleman in plain honey-fawn morning coat, over plain cream Norfolk waistcoat, the silver Devereux signet at his quiet Norfolk right hand, who had been standing in patient Norfolk attention at the careful South Porch wall. The 6th Earl of Cromer was tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, calm grey-blue eyes the colour of the North Sea Norfolk coast at autumn, weathered, fair, Cambridge-trained complexion, plain honey-fawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat, the silver Devereux signet on his right hand. Reverend Sandys, in level Norfolk composure, spoke at the careful South Porch step. Miss Pelham, His Lordship, Roland Aubrey Devereux, 6th Earl of Cromer Castle, 10 miles north on the Norfolk coast, at Cromer by the sea. Lord Cromer is the lay patron of the Bayfield, living these 5 years past. Lord Cromer, in the level Norfolk fashion, inclined his quiet head to Henrietta at the careful South Porch step. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, inclined her quiet Norfolk head in return. Miss Pelham, Lord Cromer said in the level Norfolk fashion, the late Mrs. Pelham of Bayfield I had known since the spring of 1814 at the careful Norfolk Agricultural Society meetings at Norwich, where she had been corresponding at the careful Polish-crested and Sussex Dorking question with Sir John Seabright Baronet of Beechwood Park, and where she had spoken at the careful Norfolk fashion of her own poultry yard at the South Kitchen Wall at Bayfield. At the September parish school inspection of last year, in my lay patron capacity at Reverend Sandys's quiet hand, I had seen at the schoolroom writing table one of Mrs. Pelham's poultry journal pages, the careful spangled Hamburg setting at the August hatching of 1819, and had remarked, in the careful Norfolk fashion, on the Seabright quality observation at her gentle italic. I had not in my 5 years at Cromer expected to see that careful Norfolk hand continue at the South Poultry Yard at Bayfield. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure at the careful South Porch step in her cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin with the small sprig of early Norfolk celandine at the bodice, kept her quiet Norfolk hands at her plain cream Norfolk gloves, and her calm grey eyes upon Lord Cromer's quiet, weathered Cambridge-trained face at the level Norfolk pace. Lord Cromer, she said in the level Norfolk fashion, the poultry yard at Bayfield I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Cromer, at the careful South Porch step, kept his calm grey-blue eyes upon Henrietta's quiet Norfolk face in level Norfolk attention. The careful pale gold Easter light at the careful flint and brick south porch wall lay upon the careful Devereux signet at his quiet right hand. He inclined his quiet head in level Norfolk acknowledgment. "I had hoped so, Miss Pelham," he said in the level Norfolk fashion. The careful Seabright correspondence at Bayfield is a quiet Norfolk labour. The parish has been the better for these 5 years past. I had remarked at the careful Norfolk Agricultural Society at Norwich last Michaelmas, in the late Mrs. Pelham's settled absence at the careful autumnal decline, that the careful Seabright Bantam question at Beechwood Park stood the want of a careful Bayfield correspondent at the careful North Norfolk hand. I should be glad, in the careful Norfolk fashion, of the parish patron's leave to call at the Bayfield South Library at some careful Tuesday forenoon at Miss Pelham's settled wish, on the careful Seabright question only at Mrs. Anstis's settled chaperonage. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure at the careful south porch step, kept her quiet Norfolk hands at her plain cream Norfolk gloves and her calm grey eyes upon Lord Cromer's quiet, weathered Cambridge-trained face at the level Norfolk pace. "Lord Cromer," she said in the level Norfolk fashion, at a Tuesday forenoon at the careful Norfolk fashion, on the careful Seabright question, "you shall be welcome at the South Library at Bayfield." Lord Cromer, at the careful south porch step, inclined his quiet head a third time in level Norfolk acknowledgment. Reverend Sandys, in his plain black gown, at the careful south porch step, walked Lord Cromer and Henrietta along the careful Norfolk gravel path at the patient Norfolk pace to the careful flint lich gate at the south churchyard wall, where the careful early Norfolk celandine grew, at the careful flint foot of the careful Norfolk gate, and the careful Bayfield lane stretched east along the careful Norfolk hedgerow toward the careful home pasture at Bayfield. At the careful lich gate, Lord Cromer, in the level Norfolk fashion, took quiet leave. He inclined his quiet head to Henrietta a second time in level Norfolk acknowledgment, took quiet leave of Reverend Sandys in level Norfolk converse, and walked along the careful Norfolk lane west to the careful Norfolk inn-yard at the Bayfield Feathers, where his quiet, careful Cromer chestnut had been kept at the careful Norfolk groom. Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure at the careful Flint Lich Gate, kept her quiet Norfolk gaze upon the careful Norfolk hedgerow, east along the careful Bayfield lane. Mrs. Anstis, in plum bombazine and lace cap, 3 paces behind, kept her level Norfolk silence at the careful flint wall. Reverend Sandys took quiet leave at the careful south porch step in the level Norfolk fashion, and Henrietta, in her cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin with the small sprig of early Norfolk celandine at the bodice, walked back along the careful Norfolk lane, east toward the careful home pasture at Bayfield, at the careful Norfolk pace, with Mrs. Anstis 3 paces behind in the level Norfolk fashion. The cool, clear Norfolk Easter morning lay upon the careful Norfolk hedgerow, and the careful pale gold Easter light at the careful Glaven Valley, and the careful North Sea, 4 miles north, grey-silver, under the careful pale blue Norfolk sky, and the careful early Norfolk celandine at the careful Norfolk lanefoot kept the level Norfolk fashion the Pelham family had kept all its days. At the careful Bayfield south porch of the careful Norfolk manor of 1746, Mrs. Anstis took Henrietta's plain cream Norfolk gloves at the careful Norfolk hall table. Miss Faith Anstis, at the careful small south parlour, set the careful brown Norfolk tea caddy at the careful brick hob, and Henrietta, in level Norfolk composure, walked through to the careful south library and set her quiet Norfolk hand upon the worn brown calf commonplace book at the second shelf at the south wall at the careful patient Norfolk fashion the great-aunt she had never met had kept these 47 years past at Bayfield Hall in the level Norfolk fashion the Pelham family had kept all their days. On the cool spring morning of Saturday the 6th of May, 1820, Lord Roland Aubrey Devereux, 6th Earl of Cromer, called at Bayfield Hall in the company of 4 of his nearer relations. The Cromer travelling carriage, drawn up at the south gravel sweep in the steady level, Norfolk light, that fell from the pantile roof, down across the flint and brick of the south wall, to the borders of the walled garden, where the first of the late spring stocks were lately settled. Mr. Yelverton received at the south door in his plain black tailcoat, and gave the company up the broad south passage to the south library, where Mrs. Anstice, in her lace cap and plum bombazine, had already set out the tea things at the round table near the south window. Lord Rowland inclined to Henrietta in his weathered fair complexion, and his plain honey-fawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat, and presented his party in turn in his level Norfolk gravity. Lady Aurelia Devereux, his only daughter, 6 years old, was lifted down from the carriage by her father's own hand and brought up the south passage in soft auburn hair, plaited at the nape, with grey ribbons, grey-blue eyes that were her father's own, a small plain dove-grey muslin frock with cream sash, very quiet for a child of 6. Lady Aurora Devereux Howard, Lord Rowland's married elder sister, 38, came up after in fawn travelling silk and plain pearl drops. Mr. Quentin Howard, her husband, 43, plain dark coat, level grey eyes. The Dowager Countess of Cromer, 67, Lord Rowland's mother, in plain grey silk with a small Norfolk lace cap, and her late husband's small gold mourning ring, was seated by Mr. Yelverton at the south library window, in the high-backed chair that had been the late great-aunt Mrs. Honoria's own. Mrs. Anstice poured. The tea was the Norwich black blend the late Mrs. Honoria had kept all her years. The Dowager Countess spoke first, in the level Norfolk gravity of her own settled years, of the Pelham family of Bayfield, of the Sir Theodore Pelham she had known at the Norfolk Agricultural Society dinner at the Maid's Head at Norwich in the autumn of 1808, of the late Mrs. Honoria she had met but twice in 47 years, and yet had thought of often. Henrietta acquiesced in level Norfolk composure. Lady Aurora spoke gently of the Norfolk wildflowers along the home pasture lane, and asked after the Norfolk celandines lately gone over. Mr. Quentin Howard observed quietly that the South Library at Bayfield was the finest small library he had seen in the county. The Dowager Countess inclined. Lord Rowland set his cup down upon the round table, and turned his calm grey-blue eyes upon his elder sister, and spoke in the level Norfolk gravity of the Devereux family of Cromer Castle. He observed that the small south yard at Cromer Castle, which had stood neglected these 5 years since the death of the 5th Earl, their late father, might now, in the gentle settled course of the season, be brought back into careful order, and he asked whether Lady Aurora might be willing to lay out a poultry collection demonstration at Cromer South Yard upon the careful Norfolk model of the Bayfield poultry yard at the south kitchen wall. A quiet matter of 4 breeding pens, the Dorking and the Spangled Hamburg, and the Polish Crested and the Old English Game, in the careful settled fashion the Norfolk Agricultural Society had long since approved. Lady Aurora inclined and acquiesced in her own level gravity. Lady Aurelia, at her father's side, raised her grey-blue eyes from the small plain piece of plain Norfolk shortbread Mrs. Anstice had set before her, and asked, in the very quiet voice of a child of 6, who had been carefully brought up at Cromer Castle, whether she might help with the Dorking hens. Henrietta inclined to her in level Norfolk composure, and answered gently that she might. Mrs. Anstice poured a second cup. The Dowager Countess observed that the Norfolk Agricultural Society quarterly meeting at the Maid's Head at Norwich would be held the 3rd Wednesday of the month following, and that Lord Rowland was the present lay-resident member from Cromer Castle. Mr. Quentin Howard observed that he had seen Sir John Seabright once at Beechwood Park in 1816, and had thought him a careful and a measured man, The Dowager Countess inclined and observed that the careful Seabright bantam Sir John had lately laid down at Beechwood Park in the years 1812 to 1819 had been the model of the careful Norfolk breeding pen for the better part of the present generation, and that the late Mrs. Honoria of Bayfield had been one of the small number of careful Norfolk subscribers at the Seabright correspondence at the autumn quarter. Lady Aurora observed that she had been at Beechwood Park once in the autumn of 1817 with her late husband's elder brother, and had seen the careful 4 pens at the south wall and the careful Seabright record at the small green calf journal. Lord Roland inclined to Henrietta and asked in the level Norfolk gravity of his Cambridge-trained voice whether he might be permitted to call at Bayfield the Tuesday following at the reading hour of the South Library. Henrietta acquiesced. The Devereux carriage was brought up at the South Gravel Sweep at the end of the hour, and Mr. Yelverton saw the company down the south porch, and the steady level Norfolk light fell across the South Gravel Sweep at the careful Pelham hand of the late great-aunt of 47 years. The Tuesday calls of May and of June were held at the South Library at Bayfield, in the careful settled fashion, the Pelham family of Bayfield and the Devereux family of Cromer Castle had each in their own settled hand long since kept all their days Miss Faith Anstice, the niece of Mrs. Anstice at the round table by the south window, as chaperone in her plain dove-grey muslin and her plain Norfolk cap, the small green calf poultry journal of the late great-aunt of 47 years, and the small green calf poultry journal of Henrietta of 5 years at the writing table between them, the 4 breeds, the Dorking, the Spangled Hamburg, the Polish Crested, the Old English Game, set out for careful reference at the careful Pelham hand. They read, week by week, Sir John Seabright's privately printed 1809 Art of Improving the Breeds of Domestic Animals, the Beechwood Park edition of 32 pages in plain blue paper wrappers, and Lord Roland's own 1815 notes on the Old English Game at Cromer Castle, privately printed at Cromer, 41 pages in plain grey paper wrappers, his own careful Cambridge-trained hand at the small marginal corrections. Lord Roland observed, the second Tuesday, that Sir John Seabright's careful chapter on the in and in method had been the chapter he himself had most studied in the years at Cromer. Henrietta observed the careful Spangled Hamburg paragraph at page 19, and drew his calm grey-blue eyes to the Polish crested distinction at page 22, the careful difference between the Polish crested, with its true crested feathering, and the Spangled Hamburg with its careful spangled feathering, the 2 breeds often confused by the casual observer in the East Anglian damp at the autumn quarter. Lord Roland inclined and acquiesced, and observed, in level Norfolk gravity, that he had not before considered the Polish crested versus Spangled Hamburg distinction Henrietta had drawn. Miss Faith Anstice at the round table at the south window inclined her own gentle gravity over her plain muslin and her plain Norfolk needlework, and said nothing. On the cool Tuesday morning of the 23rd of May, at the reading lectern by the South Library window, where the Seabright pamphlet lay open at page 22, and the late great-aunt's careful 1819 Polish crested entry lay open beside it, Henrietta turned to set her plain pewter pencil down at the writing table, and caught Lord Roland's calm grey-blue eyes upon her at the lectern one moment too late, and they both, in the level Norfolk, silenced the parsonage at Holt and the castle at Cromer, had each in their own settled fashion kept all their days, returned to the page. The Wednesday walks of May and of June were held at the home pasture above the Glaven, Lord Roland riding over from Cromer Castle at the early afternoon, Mr. Pendlebury, the Bayfield steward, in his plain dark coat, at the gate of the south kitchen wall, Mrs. Anstice at the south porch, with the small linen pouch in which Henrietta carried the poultry journal pencil cleaning cloth and the small folded paper of careful breeding notes for the home pasture walk. They walked the south boundary of the home pasture along the dry stone wall, the Glaven Valley below, and the gentle Norfolk Ridge above, the soft North Sea air 4 miles to the north of them. Lord Roland walked at her right hand in the level Norfolk silence of his Cambridge-trained gravity, his weathered fair complexion patient under the gentle May light, and they spoke at quiet intervals of the 4 breeds, of the late great-aunt's careful 1772 marriage entry at the Pelham Commonplace Book, of the Old English game at Cromer Castle, and the Spangled Hamburg at Holt Parsonage, of Sir John Sebright's careful 1809 chapter, and the Norfolk Agricultural Society's careful settled record. The hedgerows along the Glaven were lately gone over of the Norfolk celandine, and the first of the careful gentle Norfolk sea lavender was already lately settled at the dry stone wall at the southeast corner of the home pasture above the Glaven. On the cool Wednesday afternoon of the 7th of June, at the southeast corner of the home pasture above the Glaven, where the dry stone wall met the Bayfield boundary at the gentle Norfolk Ridge, Lord Roland set his weight to one knee at the careful flint coping of the wall, and gathered a small careful sprig of the late spring Norfolk sea lavender at the foot of the wall, very gently with his patient Cambridge-trained hand, and rose, and gave the small careful sprig to Henrietta in the level Norfolk, silence the Devereux family of Cromer Castle had long since kept all their days. Henrietta took it in her own plain ivory glove, and inclined to him in level Norfolk gravity, and placed the small careful sprig of late spring Norfolk sea lavender in the small linen pouch where the poultry journal pencil cleaning cloth was kept. Toward the close of June, on the cool Wednesday evening of the 28th, at the South Library at Bayfield, at the round table by the south window, the Sebright pamphlet closed at page 32, and the Cromer Old English game pamphlet closed at page 41. Miss Faith Anstice at the round table at the south window in her plain dove-grey muslin. Lord Roland set his calm grey-blue eyes upon Henrietta in the level Norfolk gravity of his settled hand, and asked in his level Cambridge-trained voice whether he might be permitted to call at Bayfield the Saturday hours of July following, after the Tuesday and Wednesday hours that had been so carefully kept these 8 weeks past. Henrietta acquiesced in level Norfolk gravity. Miss Faith Anstice inclined gently over her plain Norfolk needlework, and said nothing. The Saturday calls of July were held at the South Library at Bayfield from 3 of the afternoon to 5, Miss Faith Anstice chaperone at the round table at the south window in her plain dove-grey muslin and her plain Norfolk cap, the Sebright pamphlet and the Cromer Old English game pamphlet set out for careful reference at the writing table, the small green calf poultry journal of the late great-aunt of 1772, and the small green calf poultry journal of Henrietta of 1815, set out side by side as the matter of careful settled comparison. Lord Roland spoke quietly of the Cromer South Yard demonstration Lady Aurora was lately laying out at Cromer Castle, of the careful 4 pens his elder sister had set out at the south wall, of the careful Dorking pair that had been the first to come up from the Bayfield model, of the small voice of Lady Aurelia at the Dorking pen of a cool July morning, of the careful settled record at the small green calf journal Lady Aurora had laid out at the Cromer South Yard at her own measured hand. Henrietta inclined and acquiesced, and observed in her own level Norfolk gravity the careful Spangled Hamburg pen the late great-aunt had kept at Bayfield these 5 years past, and the careful Polish crested pen of the autumn of 1819 at the careful Sebright Foundation. Lord Roland acquiesced. The Saturday calls were so kept across the 4 Saturdays of July at the careful level Norfolk pace the late great-aunt and the late grandfather and the late father had each in their own settled fashion kept all their days. On the cool Saturday afternoon of the 5th of August, 1820, at 3 of the afternoon at the south parlour at Bayfield Hall, where the small round table had been set out at the south window, and the green calf poultry journal of Henrietta lay closed at the inner page, Lord Rowland Aubrey Devereux, 6th Earl of Cromer, was received by Mr. Yelverton at the south door in his plain honey-fawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat. Henrietta was already at the south parlour in plain cream and grey, sprigged Norfolk muslin, plain Norfolk cap, plain ivory gloves, the small linen pouch with the small, careful sprig of the 7th of June at her inner pocket. Mr. Yelverton withdrew. Mrs. Anstice at the south passage withdrew. The south parlour door was closed. Lord Rowland set his calm, grey-blue eyes upon Henrietta in the level Norfolk gravity of his Cambridge-trained hand, and spoke. He observed that he had known the late Mrs. Honoria Pelham these 6 years past at the Norfolk Agricultural Society. He observed that he had seen at Reverend Sandys's hand at the parish school inspection of the September quarter of 1819 one of the late Mrs. Honoria's careful poultry journal pages, and had remarked at that hour on the careful soubright quality of the record. I have come, having read with measured admiration the careful Polish crested record at your hand these 4 years, to ask you to consider whether you might be the next Countess of Cromer at the level Norfolk, pace your own soubright correspondence has taught me to admire. He observed that the small south yard at Cromer Castle was now lately laid out at Lady Aurora's careful hand at the Bayfield model. He observed that Lady Aurelia had asked at the Dorking Pen of a Wednesday morning when Miss Pelham might be next to call. He observed that he asked the matter at the level Norfolk, pace the Pelham family of Bayfield and the Devereux family of Cromer had each in their own settled fashion kept all their days. He observed gently that he should be patient at her answer. Henrietta inclined to him in level Norfolk gravity, and answered, "Lord Cromer, I shall." Lord Rowland inclined to her in his own level, Norfolk gravity, and set the small plain Devereux silver signet at his right hand to the small round table at the south window, and acquiesced. Lady Aurelia was brought down at 4 of the afternoon, by the Dowager Countess in plain dove-grey travelling silk, in her own small plain dove-grey muslin frock and cream sash and grey ribbons in her soft auburn plait. She came up the south passage at her grandmother's hand, and stood quiet at the south parlour door in the level Norfolk gravity that a child of 6, who had been carefully brought up at Cromer Castle, had already learned from her father and her grandmother. Henrietta inclined to her, and Lord Rowland set his patient Cambridge-trained hand to his daughter's shoulder, and observed, very gently, that Miss Pelham of Bayfield had acquiesced to come to Cromer Castle in the level Norfolk fashion of the autumn following. Lady Aurelia raised her grey-blue eyes, that were her father's own, to Henrietta, and inclined in the small, careful gravity of her 6 years, and asked in her very quiet voice whether she might still help with the Dorking hens at Cromer South Yard. Henrietta inclined to her in level Norfolk composure, and answered gently that she might. The banns were called at St. Margaret's of Bayfield by Holt on the 3 Sundays following, the Sunday of the 13th of August at Reverend Sandys's level, Norfolk gravity at the morning service, the Sunday of the 20th of August at Reverend Sandys's level hand at the morning service, the Sunday of the 27th of August at Reverend Sandys's level, Norfolk gravity at the morning service, no impediment lodged, no objection raised, the parish of Bayfield by Holt and the parish of Cromer by the Sea, inclining to the matter in their own level, Norfolk fashion. Mrs. Letheringset of Bayfield Village, the village dressmaker of 22 years' careful settled service at the south parlour bench, was engaged at the south parlour of Bayfield Hall to lay out the cream Norfolk muslin morning gown of the bride. Mrs. Anstice brought up the Pelham family pearls from the small Pelham strongbox at the South Library. Mr. Pendlebury laid out the careful steward's accounts at the South Library writing table at the Lady Day quarter, and was quietly thanked. On the cool September morning of Saturday the 9th of September, 1820, at 10 of the morning, at the parish church of St. Margaret's, of Bayfield by Holt, where Reverend Sandys in his plain black gown stood at the chancel step, and the small congregation of the parish of Bayfield by Holt and of the parish of Cromer by the Sea, inclined in the level Norfolk gravity each had kept all their days, Miss Henrietta Pelham of Holt walked up the south aisle on the patient arm of Mr. Camberwell of Holt, solicitor and attorney at law these 40 years past, in his plain dark wool and his gold-rimmed spectacles. Mrs. Cromer of Holt, Henrietta's parsonage friend and the principal of the Holt Reading School, walked matron of honour at her left hand in plain dove-grey silk and plain Norfolk pearl drops. The Dowager Countess of Cromer in plain grey silk and small Norfolk lace cap, and her late husband's small gold mourning ring, was set at the front pew at the right hand of the aisle, with Lady Aurelia at her side, in plain dove-grey muslin and cream sash and grey ribbons in her soft auburn plait, very quiet for a child of 6. Mr. Quentin Howard, 43, plain dark coat, level grey eyes, stood at Lord Rowland's right hand at the chancel step. Lady Aurora Devereux Howard, 38, in fawn silk and plain pearl drops, was set at the front pew at the left hand of the aisle. Henrietta was in the cream Norfolk muslin morning gown by Mrs. Letheringset's careful hand, plain settled cut, plain Norfolk sleeves, plain Norfolk hem, a small careful sprig of late summer Norfolk sea lavender of the home pasture above the Glaven, and one white and cream Norfolk rose of the walled south garden at the bodice, the Pelham family pearls, Norwich, marked 1788, at the throat, plain ivory silk gloves, plain ivory silk slippers, the small careful silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Pelham, Norwich, 1808, at the inner pocket of her plain ivory underdress. Lord Rowland at the chancel step was in plain dark Norfolk coat, plain cream waistcoat, plain cream small clothes, plain dark stock at the throat, the small plain silver Devereux signet at the right hand. Reverend Sandys read the service in the level Norfolk gravity of his 49 years at the parish curacy of Bayfield by Holt. The vows were exchanged in level Norfolk gravity at the chancel step. The ring was set at Henrietta's left hand by Lord Rowland in the level Norfolk. Silence the Devereux family of Cromer Castle had long since kept all their days. The register was signed at the small vestry table by Lord Rowland's level Cambridge trained hand, and by Henrietta's level Norfolk hand, and by Mr. Camberwell as witness in his level 40-year hand, and by Mr. Quentin Howard as second witness in his level grey hand. The small congregation of the parish of Bayfield by Holt and of the parish of Cromer by the Sea inclined as the company came down the south aisle. The wedding breakfast was held at Bayfield Hall in the south dining parlour, at the long table that the late Mrs. Honoria had kept all her years, and the late great-aunt's mother, Mrs. Pelham of the Norfolk Coast Pelhams, had kept all her years before her. Mrs. Anstice had laid out the careful Norfolk hams of the home pasture, and the careful Norfolk fowl of the south kitchen yard, and the careful Norfolk preserves of the walled south garden, and the careful Norfolk cheese of the home dairy, and the careful Norfolk seed cake of Mrs. Anstice's own settled hand in plain settled order. The Norwich silver marked 1788 at the careful Pelham hand at the long table. Mr. Yelverton poured. The Dowager Countess at the head observed that the level Norfolk gravity of the morning had been very fitting. Lady Aurora observed gently that the Bayfield South Library was the finest small library she had seen in the county. Mr. Quentin Howard observed the careful Norfolk hams. Lady Aurelia at her grandmother's side ate her plain Norfolk shortbread quietly and asked of a sudden whether the Polish crested cock at the south kitchen yard might come up to Cromer South Yard at the autumn quarter. Lord Roland inclined to his daughter and answered, gently, that the matter would be settled at the careful Norfolk pace of the season following. Henrietta inclined to her stepdaughter in level Norfolk composure and acquiesced. Here ends the chronicle of Miss Henrietta Pelham of Holt, who became, by the patient asking of the 6th Earl of Cromer, the 11th Countess of Cromer in the level Norfolk fashion her own late grandmother had kept all her days. Silken embrace. And so on the cool September morning of the 9th September, 1820, in the parish church of St. Margaret's of Bayfield by Holt, in the level Norfolk fashion, the Pelham family kept all their days. Miss Henrietta Pelham, who had sat in level Norfolk silence on the cool Tuesday morning of the 23rd of November at the chambers of Mr. Camberwell at Holt, and heard read aloud the last will and testament of the great aunt she had never met, became, by the patient asking of the 6th Earl of Cromer, the 11th Countess of Cromer, in the level Norfolk fashion her own late grandmother, Mrs. Pelham, had kept all her days.